Good morning.
Good morning.
Much better, much better. How are you all? Good, good. I am doing really well because I'm here with you all. I'm happy to be here. I did not know this was your first in-person event in 2 years. I feel a little bit more pressure now to be interesting. But I will tell you this. When I first started doing events, when people started inviting you out to come talk and do things in person again, I was getting these amazing reactions. You know, people would just cheer and they'd be so excited and everything. I was like, wow, I'm really popular. And then it occurred to me, I was like, oh, they're just happy to be out of their houses, actually. It's not really about me. It's like, oh, I'm not in the living room. I'm not on Zoom anymore. So anything that happens here, if it goes really well, I will just attribute it to I've gotten them out of their living rooms, and so mission accomplished. I would like to thank this community for inviting me. I'm always humbled and honored to have the opportunity to interact with people and to come and to talk about my work and my observations. My work as a journalist and my work as a historian have given me a particular vantage point on the world we live in and the moment that we occupy. And I'm always happy to be able to go out and to engage in dialogue with people and to hear what they think in exchange. So today I want to talk a little bit about, I think if we think about what ties all of these themes together, what I want to talk to you about is democracy and the moment that we're in our democracy. It's not hyperbole, it's not exaggeration, overheated rhetoric to say that we're in a moment of crisis. Our democracy finds itself in a period of volatility, difficulty. There is concern, and this is not simply a partisan concern. One thing that I have found is that 69%, a recent kind of study showed that 69% of Democrats and an equal number, 69% of Republicans, feel that American democracy is in jeopardy. And they see this jeopardy coming from vastly different directions. It reminds me of a headline that was for a study. It was an actual study that was done, and the headline said, study shows divorced couples cannot agree on what ended the marriage. Right. I was kind of like, well, that's not that shocking. And so we have this moment of crisis. We disagree very much across partisan and political lines about what the nature of the crisis is and what the nature of the threat is. And so I want to talk a little bit about where I come into this as a historian, where I come into this as a journalist, and then we can engage in some dialogue. 7 years ago, I was sent to Charleston, South Carolina. I was sent there abruptly by the New Yorker magazine. And I was there to cover a shooting that took place in the Emmanuel AME Church on Calhoun Street in Charleston, South Carolina. The church is among the oldest historic Black institutions in Charleston, has its origins in the period of slavery, and it is located on a street named for John C. Calhoun, the statesman and among the most preeminent defenders of slavery and white supremacy in South Carolina's history. If you were to walk down the street from that church, previously, there was this gigantic statue in homage to John C. Calhoun. It's been removed in the last 2 years. But this was the landscape of this community. The reason I was there was to cover the aftermath of the shooting of 9 people in the basement of the church by a white supremacist by the name of Dylan Roof. When I went there for the initial incident and I reported about what was happening in this community, I went back more than a year later when Dylan Roof went on trial, and I covered the trial. Among the things that became quickly apparent in the course of my experiences in South Carolina was that there were parallel realities at play. When he was arrested and interrogated, Dylan Roof said he had killed these 9 African Americans in order to wake white people up. He felt that they were at risk of permanently losing their position at the top of American society, and that the society had never been intended to have the kind of multiracial democracy that was occurring all around. So he did this almost as a kind of alarm bell in the night to awaken people to reassert the cause of white supremacy. This was an interesting moment for this to happen. It happened in 2015, which was the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. It was also the anniversary of the release of the film Birth of a Nation, which had been a homage, the original film of American cinema. When we look at the history of American cinema, it traces its roots back to this film, Birth of a Nation, which was created by the filmmaker D.W. Griffith 50 years after the end of the Civil War. And lots of people talk about this film. Now, if you study cinema, you may see the film. I used to show the film in my class. It is a depiction of the aftermath of the Civil War, and it shows the Ku Klux Klan as the kind of avenging, heroic figure. If we think of the action hero in American history or American culture, the original action hero dates back to this film, and the action heroes in question here are the Ku Klux Klan. And so it romanticizes the Klan and its campaign to remove black people from political and social contention in the aftermath of the Civil War. So this is the anniversary of this film. And what D.W. Griffith proposed in that film, it tells the story of a northern family and a southern family. What he proposed in this film was that the lingering animosities of the Civil War could be reconciled through the mutual contempt of white Northerners and white Southerners for black people. That their shared hatred could become the basis of a new fraternity, of a new form of unity in American society that would bind up the wounds of the war and the lingering animosities. So all these things are kind of echoing in my mind as he issues this call. I'd like to say that these were simply the actions of an individual who was consumed by hate and committed this atrocity. And it was a moment without any other sort of context. But that's not what has happened. We've seen subsequent to this a kind of unfolding, a growth of a similar mindset. We've seen the emergence and reemergence of a radicalized white nationalist movement intent upon following through on the objectives that Dylan Roof stated on that night in June of 2015. And so how do we get to this moment? And how do we find the particular crisis that we have? So we can kind of see in Charlottesville In 2017, another moment where this ticks up. And if we look on January 6th, 2021, in which we saw the United States Capitol attacked by people, some of whom wore extremist, far-right, white nationalist insignias and paraphernalia. How did we get to this moment? Well, I'll talk to you a little bit about my own background, and then we'll talk a little bit about American history, and we'll start to see some themes that connect. So, I was born and raised in Queens, New York. I'm very happy. I'm a very much a booster for Queens, New York. I was born the year that the New York Mets won their first World Series. The Mets played in New York. I was raised Catholic, and when I was christened, my whole family, with the exception of my father and the priest, were sweating it out in this church, waiting to start the christening. My father, they didn't know where my father was. They didn't know where the priest was, Father Ernie. But they were tucked away watching the end of the World Series. And so, there was a lot of conflict. My mother told me this was the maddest she had ever been at a priest. So, I grew up in Queens. I played baseball. I almost had to play baseball after that. I played baseball as a young person, and in high school, I played right field. I was a right fielder. I had a pretty good, strong throwing arm. You have a right fielder, you need somebody who has a good throwing arm. That's where I played. Our center fielder was pretty quick and coincidentally happened to be of a family of South Asian origin. And our left fielder was really good, and his family was from Colombia. Our first baseman was Jewish. Our second baseman was, I believe he's from El Salvador. Third baseman was African American. Catcher was Jamaican. And we would jokingly say that we looked like the United Nations when we took the field. We also were terrible. That's just terrible. But that was kind of beside the point. We represented all of these communities. And I came to know at some point in my studies that Queens, where I grew up, was statistically the most diverse county in the United States. How did that come to be? Well, New York is a very diverse city, and Queens, which is one part of New York City, is the most diverse portion of it. In order to understand how that happened, we have to go a little bit further back. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed two historic pieces of legislation right near each other in about a 2-month span. The first was the Voting Rights Act, 1965. It's political context we'll talk about, but it is arguably the centerpiece of the civil rights movement. It is the legislation which is now under significant political assault now. But in 1965, this was the legislation that enabled African Americans who had, through violence and intimidation, been pushed out of the political system. And it created protections to make sure that anyone could vote without having to fear for the loss of their lives. As just an aside, we'll just put a pin in this and come back. One of my kind of foundational memories is my father taking me with him into the booth in the presidential election of 1976. My father was from Georgia originally. He went into the booth to vote for his fellow Georgian, Jimmy Carter. This was in Queens, and he took me into the booth, showed me what he was doing, and tried to impress upon me the importance of casting your ballot. I was 5 or 6 at the time. And it took me decades to actually understand, and long after my father had passed, decades to actually understand why he did that and why that was important. The reason he did it was because had he attempted to vote as a young person in his native state of Georgia, he very likely would have been killed at the time in which he grew up. Not permissible for black people to vote in Georgia at that time. So 1965 Voting Rights Act, Lyndon B. Johnson signs that in August. Tremendous piece of legislation, transforms the face of American political society. About 2 months after that, he signs the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Reform Act. What that did was change the face of the United States. And in order to understand why that was important, we also have to go a little bit further back in history. In 1924, the United States Congress passed something called the Johnson Act. It was an Immigration Restriction Act. It was a racist law. That's not my assessment. I'm not saying, this is not me editorializing. People who passed the law advocated for particular beliefs that we would now say were racist. That only certain groups were intelligent enough to actually be citizens. And we should prevent other groups from coming to the United States and diluting the population that was actually capable of the responsibilities of citizenship. And in order to do that, they created a complicated quota system which said that you can't come in any more than 10% of your representation in the census. And this was the 1924 law, so instead of using the most recent census, 1920, they went all the way back to the 1890 census. Why did they go back to the 1890 census? Because when we look at when the majority of immigrants came, the biggest tide of immigrants to come into the United States, it was in that time period between 1880 or so and 1920. And so they wanted to make it more difficult for people to come into the United States whom they deemed to be inferior. They looked at race in ways that were not identical to how we look at race now. Which is to say, they didn't necessarily think that Italians would make good citizens either. They didn't necessarily think that Jews would make good citizens. They wanted to make it more difficult for people who represented these communities that they looked at somewhat skeptically to continue to arrive in the country. And so 1965, in the midst of a push to change the way the United States existed and operated in the world, our immigration laws are changed. And we become a society that allows people to immigrate from anywhere in the world. We don't hold preconceptions about who you are and what you're capable of doing based upon what you look like. At least in theory, we're not supposed to do that. And so the law changes things. How does this relate to me and my baseball team? I don't quite know. I just told you that story just because. No. I mean, there's a connection. I don't know what the connection is. I don't know if anyone knows what the connection is. I have a kind of joke, about why Queens became so diverse. One thing is that if you go to New York, both of the airports are in Queens. John F. Kennedy Airport, LaGuardia Airport, they're both in Queens. And so if you're a person who is immigrating into the United States and you come to New York, as very many people do, the first place that you're going to experience is Queens. So I was talking to a friend of mine who's a journalist, also from Queens, Indian American journalist, and her parents migrated to the United States. And I said, how did Queens get this population? And she was like, I don't really know, but my parents traveled 5,000 miles to get to the United States and then refused to go further than 2 miles from the airport. It's like they landed, looked around, was like, this'll do, good. And so there's this burgeoning Indian population, this burgeoning Pakistani population, this burgeoning El Salvadoran population, a burgeoning population of people from Eastern Europe, a burgeoning Greek population, a burgeoning, all of these places that explode into this amazing vista of culture and a really kind of complex tapestry of different communities. As an aside, the place where I grew up, Queens, which no one would ever go to before, now is a hot destination. Why? Because people realized that you can get food from all over the world. There are communities everywhere, and there are restaurants that serve all of these places. So now that I'm finished with the Tourism Bureau of Queens portion of the conversation, why do I talk about this? Because en route to the version of this story that I have given glosses over some bigger complexities. And for me, it was a moment of revelation when I realized that the community I grew up in was a metaphor for bigger dynamics across the entire country. And what I mean by that is this. Prior to 1965, Queens was the second whitest borough of New York City. After 1965, within 20 years, it is the most diverse county in the whole country. That process created aftershocks and created reactions. And for a generation of people, the rapid diversification of their community was a sign of alarm. It was a reason to be concerned. You began to see people move away in large numbers. Large portion of the white population of Queens began to move away. This was depicted, for some people who were old enough to remember, this was depicted in a kind of classic American sitcom called All in the Family. There's a character by the name of Archie Bunker, who, if you Google him, you'll see, the great actor Carol O'Connor brought this character to life in this sitcom, and he was a white working class Queens resident who is confused by all the social changes happening around him. And one of the big kind of comic foils of the story of the season, of the show, is that a black family moves in next door. And he doesn't understand quite what to make of the world with this place that he's grown up in, or this place that he works, being so different than how it had typically been. Those dynamics did not only happen in Queens, they began to happen across the country in broader and bigger kinds of ways. They accelerated in 2008 when the first African American president was elected. By 2016, the same sorts of dynamics that we saw in Queens in the 1960s were visible in different communities around the country. And so I'm from Queens. There's someone else who's very prominent in American political life who's also from Queens. We're separated by a generation. We're separated by race. That person grew up in a place called Jamaica Estates. I grew up in a place called South Jamaica. Everything that you need to know about the relationship between those communities can be understood by their names. Jamaica Estates was at the top of the hill. South Jamaica was at the bottom of the hill. Jamaica Estates was wealthy and overwhelmingly white. South Jamaica working class, Black and Latino. And for that generation, the language of resentment, the language of concern, the language of fear became commonplace. And I'll tell you just one example of this and the kind of distinctions. In the aftermath of 9/11, September 11th, when it was extremely nerve-wracking to get on an airplane, I had to take a flight from Atlanta to New York City. I get on the plane, and I'm seated maybe in the middle of the airplane in an aisle seat. And I see someone get on the plane who has on a white tunic, he's wearing a teffiyah, he has a long beard, and he begins walking down the aisle toward me. And you can almost see the tension ratcheting up as he comes closer. He sits down across the aisle from me, one row back. And I look over at him, and I look at him again, and I say, "Excuse me, where are you from?" And he looks at me and says, "Where are you from?" Everybody's paying attention now, everybody around. It's like, oh my God, the Black guy is gonna save us from the Muslim guy. And I said, "I'm from Queens." And he said, "Good." And I said, "Well, I'm asking because I think you're also from Queens. And if you are who I think you are, we were in the same breakdance crew in high school." And he looks at me and he goes, "Jelani?" And I said, "Shake?" He stood up, we hugged, we had this conversation, everybody's relaxing. I was like, oh, he was a breakdancer, he's not gonna kill us. But what was significant to me in that moment was that in this period of panic, in this moment in which it was easy to see a person and project all of these ideas about hostility, danger, foreigner, different, enemy, etc. What I saw was a friend, a person whom I had spent formative hours in my youth with, a person whose home I had visited. And I understood him on the level of an individual. And that's really the kind of best of the democratic process or promise. But it's been difficult to attain because we found ourselves caught in this battle over who is actually entitled to be an American, about who the idea of Americanism is supposed to extend to. And this is a debate that goes back to the origins of this country. We have difficulty countenancing it. But if I say that white supremacy has been a foundational force in the creation of the United States since its inception, our initial reaction is to say, well, that's overstating it. But I'll tell you, I gave a speech in Maine a couple of years ago. So I go up to Maine. People could not be more welcoming. Senator Angus King comes to the talk. You know, I was at a college there. I was speaking at the chapel, this amazing, beautiful building. There was just a little dusting of snow on the ground. It was like a New England postcard, you know. So I was like, oh, great, you know. And I'm feeling really anxious. I'm really, really kind of nervous because I know what I'm about to say. There's this wonderful audience, and I say, thank you, I'm happy to be here. I appreciate your invitation. This state only exists because of white supremacy. And people are kind of thrown for a second, and then they gradually start to think about the Compromise of 1820, when Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, but there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, and it was a complete balance between the two. And if Missouri entered as a slave state, it would mean that there were more slave states than free states, meaning politically that there would be 2 more senators representing slave states than there would be from free states, that there would be an increase in the number of congressional reps from the slave state, and it created this political impasse. Henry Clay, the great negotiator, carves out a deal in which they take the northeastern portion of Massachusetts, turn it into a separate state, which serves the purpose of counterbalancing Missouri. And so it is a compromise that allows for the further growth and expansion of the white supremacist system of slavery that allows Maine to become a state. And people are like, oh yeah, that's right. Go on with my talk. I left Maine and went to Florida. When I got to Florida, I spoke at Florida State. When I got to Florida, I told the people what I'd said to the people in Maine, and they were like, oh my God. I said, well, before you get too smug, let's talk about how Florida became part of the Union. And how in 1820, the upstart general, Andrew Jackson, for whom Jacksonville is named, Jacksonville, Florida, at the behest of slaveholders in Georgia and in South Carolina, invaded what was then a Spanish territory called Florida, because the indigenous populations in Florida and the Spanish themselves would not recognize American claims to human property. If you were a person who escaped slavery in Georgia into Florida, they would not return you. And so slaveholders in Georgia were concerned that they were losing so much money. They petitioned Andrew Jackson, who, without the approval of President Monroe, marches into Florida to in the pathway of freedom for the slaves in Georgia and to subjugate the indigenous populations there who were making raids across the state line. That's the purpose. That's how we get to Florida. Creates an international incident. There's a bit of hasty diplomacy. The United States purchases Florida to try to make it seem as if this had all been part of a plan. And that's how we get Florida. I could talk about those 13 states that in total or in some portion come out of the Louisiana Purchase, and how they were the product of the Haitian Revolution, the slave revolt in Haiti, that pushed the French out of their most prosperous and viable Western colonial holding and motivated Napoleon to give Thomas Jefferson the fire sale discount when he bought that huge swath of land that doubled the size of the United States. I could talk about Texas. When we say remember the Alamo, we don't remember everything about the Alamo, and how the conflict between the American settlers and what was then the northeastern portion of Mexico, now the state of Texas, the conflict centered around the fact that the Mexican government had given land to these settlers. They had a couple of provisions. They saw how much money the Americans were making from cotton. They said, we'll give you land, you know how to grow cotton, we'll make revenue from the cotton that you grow. We have a couple of caveats here, which is that we're a Catholic nation, so if you come here, you have to convert to Catholicism, which was promptly ignored by the American settlers there. And the other point was that because Mexico had abolished slavery in 1836, they said you can't use slave labor to grow this cotton, which is another provision that the Americans promptly ignored. And it was the friction over these things that ultimately generates the breakaway of Texas to become the Lone Star Republic and eventually part of the United States, only to secede from the United States shortly thereafter when they're concerned that the United States federal government will take their slaves away. And so we see this again in Texas. Or we could talk about California. We could go on. The basics of our geography reflect the prerogatives of white supremacy. our Constitution, our founding documents, our Declaration of Independence. We can walk through all these things and see our foundational conflict in this country, the American Civil War, in which more than 700,000 people died, to get a sense of how titanic a war that was. This was the 19th century with comparatively crude weapons. But in order to achieve that number of fatalities in 20th century warfare, the United States would have to fight World War II almost twice. We would have to fight Vietnam about 12 times to get to the number of fatalities that happened in the course of the 4 years of the American Civil War. And what's at the center of this conflict, what's at the center of this war? The question of whether or not it will be constitutional and permissible to buy, sell, rape, exploit, traffic, abuse, and own human beings. This is the question. And we expend the lives of 700,000 plus people to come to a conclusion on it. And so, looking at the circumstances in which Dylann Roof did what he did in 2015, and we saw the reaction that we saw to those actions, I began to think about the kind of relationship between history and the present. And the way that history, we think of history as far distant, but it's really just beneath the surface. That became very clear to me one afternoon when I was there in South Carolina covering Dylann Roof's trial. I'd walked past this building. My hotel was about 6 or 7 blocks from the courthouse. And so each morning I would get up, I would leave my hotel, I would walk down to the courthouse. I walked past this building and I always looked at the street level version, part of the building. But one day I happened to look up and saw that I was walking past the South Carolina Confederate Museum. And so that afternoon, when I'm coming back from court, I stop in. There are 2 women there, 2 docents, could not have been more gracious. I still had my media badge on. I'd forgotten to take it off. And so one of the women, the older woman, says to me, no, actually a younger woman says to me, welcome, what brings you to Charleston? And I said, I'm here to cover the trial of Dylann Roof. And the older woman said, oh, we don't need a trial, just get rid of him. I said, what do you mean? She said, just get rid of him. I said, well, it's interesting you would say that because the jury is right now deliberating about whether or not to give him the death penalty. And she said, don't need to deliberate, just get rid of him. And so I ask what I think is the most obvious question. What do you make of the idea that Dylann Roof did what he did in order to memorialize, he did what he did in homage to the cause that is being memorialized in this museum? That question went over exactly the way you think it did. And everyone in the museum said, that's not true. And so I follow up. I'm a journalist. I know it is important to come with a follow-up question. Can you explain to me why the Confederate flag factored so prominently in his act? He literally draped himself in the Confederate flag. She said, he didn't understand what the Confederacy was about. The Confederacy was not about hate. And I said, well, why is it that white supremacist organizations around the world fly the Confederate flag? They just saw it on the internet. They don't really understand what the Confederacy was about. Now, mind you, we are literally standing next to the South Carolina Orders of Secession, in which the South Carolina legislature said In 1861, we are leaving the United States because they want to take our slaves from us. And what occurred to me was that Dylann Roof was evil, but he wasn't a liar. And that there were people who it was much easier to think of as good who had embraced this lie, which created the fertile soil in which the disaster we are currently dealing with has been able to grow and flourish. So it is our denial of these difficult facts about American society and American history which have brought us to the brink of this conflict, of this crisis. The last thing I'll say is this. What we are looking at and what we are grappling with are the same sorts of questions that arose in 1870 when the formerly enslaved black men were given the right to vote. It created a wave of lynching in order to make sure that they could not exercise their rights. The same dynamic that we saw in 1888 when allegations that the Chinese were taking jobs from Americans and bringing drugs into the country, sound familiar, led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1888. The same dynamics that we saw that led to the Johnson Act of 1924. And it becomes this question of how expansive a view of citizenship we are willing to embrace and how hard we're willing to fight to bring that into existence. Do we want the world in which we see the person coming down the aisle as our friend or potential friend, or do we want the world in which we see that person as a vector of danger and fear, someone against whom we have to protect ourselves? I'll tell you one last story before we open up for questions. After the Roof trial, I flew, well, in the aftermath of it, I talked to a man by the name of Malcolm Graham. His sister, Cynthia Graham Hurd, had been one of the people who died in the church. She was a librarian at the University of South Carolina. She had been a pillar in her community. Malcolm was her younger brother. He talked about how she looked out for him and how she gave him advice as a young person. And he said to me that he was going to spend the rest of his life telling the world who his sister had been. This was a heavy experience, as you might imagine. I left, this was in the evening. I left the next day on the earliest flight out of Charleston. Flew to LaGuardia Airport in New York, then got a taxi to JFK Airport, where I boarded a flight for San Francisco, where I had a meeting that evening. Fly 5.5 hours to San Francisco, land, get in a taxi, go to my hotel. As I'm getting out of the hotel, as getting out of the taxi, I realized that the weight of this experience has been such that I have not spoken to another human being this entire day. So just to make conversation, I asked the bellman in the hotel lobby if he's from San Francisco. He says, no, not really from San Francisco. I might as well be. I've been here for 10 years, but originally I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. I said, oh, that's interesting. That's where I'm coming from. And he said, what brought you to Charleston? And I said, I was there to cover the trial of Dylan Roof. And his whole demeanor changed. And he got this pained expression on his face. And he said, that man took someone away who was very special to me. And I said, who? He said, my childhood librarian. Her name was Cynthia Graham Hurd. What? He said it again. And so I go up to my hotel room, and I immediately call Malcolm Graham. And I was like, Malcolm, I mean, I flew all the way across the country. I just get in a conversation. First person I talked to tells me he knew your sister. She was special to him. I thought that his reaction would be shocked. And Malcolm said, that's about right. So what it occurred to me was that I had begun that day a half mile from the Atlantic in Charleston. And at the end of that day, I was less than a mile from the Pacific in San Francisco. I had gone as far as I could go across the breadth of the United States. And the question that I had been thinking about, the issue that I had been trying to get away from in Charleston, was present in the first conversation I had in San Francisco. What that means to me is that the issues that we've talked about in the course of this conversation, they're not particular to any community, to any time, to any place, to any narrow construct, but they confront all of us. They cover the span of the country, and the imperative is that we muster the courage, the will, and the diligence to confront it. Thank you.